Hello, welcome to another worm farming Q&A live on White Navy Gardening and Worm Farm. Today we're going to be discussing worm farm on a commercial basis because I know there are a few persons who are interested in selling worms or the castings, or they might have a surplus. So we're going to be discussing that today. So what can you do if you have more worms or more castings than you actually need? If you have more worms or castings than you need, then you can choose to share it with your friends and family, or you can sell the excess that you have. What type of composting worms should you use if you are going to be selling worms commercially? Well, that depends. It depends on the type of worms that you are more familiar with. It depends on your clients. For example, what if you are selling not just in your local, but you're selling internationally? You have to consider where you're going to sell to, because if you're selling, say you're selling to somewhere that is hot, then you know that the worms that are best able to survive in the heat, like your blue worm and your African night crawlers, those are the worms that you would consider raising. If you're selling to areas that has colder temperatures, then you want to consider your red wigglers, your European night crawlers, and oh hi Auntie Garden, yes, your red wigglers, your Canadian night crawlers, although these are a bit tricky to raise because they require cool temperatures at all times. So as the time gets warm, you have to do a little more than usual to ensure that they stay cool. Or you can raise your European night crawlers. In just a minute, please. Okay. Hi, Meals 7 Up. I'm doing okay. How are you doing? Yeah, so these are the things that you have to consider. You have to take your clients and where they're located. If you are more interested in raising a particular type of worm for selling, then you still have to consider your clients. So you will restrict yourself to what clients you're able to sell to based on their location. The good thing is that for the red wigglers and the European night crawlers, these are very good for practically any region. Oh, hi, Melanie. Right, so if you want worms that you can sell to just about any regions, then your European night crawlers and your red wigglers, these are the best. If you were on my, uh, if you saw my video last week, Saturday, then you would have realized that the compost, the worm bins that I had in my garage that froze when we had the -50, -60s weather, those bins that were frozen when they thaw out, surprisingly enough, the red wigglers in them survived, even though red wigglers doesn't do well with cold or freezing temperatures. They did survive, maybe because they were only frozen for a week or so. So based on that, you know that red wigglers would be your best bet, and your European night crawlers if you're going to sell commercially, because they can withstand a more drastic change in temperature more than your African night crawlers, your blue worms, and definitely the Canadian night crawlers. They are the most challenging to raise. And if you are selling Canadian night crawlers to people who are going to be using it for something other than for fishing, then you might have your clients calling you constantly telling you that their worms are dying off because of the environment that it is in. So these are things that you have to consider when you're thinking of doing a commercial worm farm. That's good that they have survived. Yes, thank you. I was very happy because I felt so sad for them when I saw that they were frozen. I was going through the bin, sifting out the castings from those bins that were frozen, and I realized that, oh, hi, Eric. I realized that the quantity of worms that was in the bin prior to them freezing, I don't have that quantity, so I don't think so. I think that maybe they crawled out of the bin when they saw that it was getting cold. So I still lost some of the worms, but that's fine. The ones that remain in the bins, they survived. So I'm thankful for that. Yes. So, what type of bins are best for commercial worm farming? Now, first, if you're planning to do commercial worm farming, you have to consider whether or not you're going to be doing a large scale commercial worm farm or you're going to do a small scale commercial worm farm. With that in mind, you have to consider the type of setup that you're going to have as well. So you can have windrows, you can have continuous flow through system, and not the domestic kinds where you see them where they have like a 2 by 2 bin that tapers down, so it gets smaller at the bottom with an opening at the bottom where you harvest your castings. That would not be good for a commercial worm farm because it is a lot of work. It is a small space for your worms to grow, so you would have to have a really large amount of that. So the domestic type of continuous flow through system would not be good for a commercial worm farm. Then you have the stackable trays that you can use. This too, you will have to have a lot of it. And then you can use 5-gallon pails as well. You'll also have to have a lot of that. Now, you can have trays on shelves like I do, but then there are a lot of factors that you have to consider if you're going to be putting them on tiered shelves. So I'm going to be discussing that a little bit further. You can also use raised boxes, and they can be various sizes. You can make them 2 feet or 2.5 feet by 4 by 8 by 12. It is all up to you how large you want them. It really doesn't matter how big the bin is. You can also have these same bins but on the ground. So it would be something similar to a windrow, except that the windrow is actually a trench in the ground that you would have your worms raising in. So each of these type of setup that I have mentioned, I'm going to be discussing each of them in more detail so that if you're interested in doing commercial worm farming, then you will have more information. You'll be in a better position to make an informed decision as to what works best for you. All right, so what do you need to consider when you're starting a commercial worm farm? You need to consider who your clients are going to be. Eric showing so much love. Yeah. Lots of loving. Yes. So you would have to consider who your clients are going to be. Are they going to be commercial entities? Are they going to be domestic entities, like, for example, a backyard gardener or a fisherman, something like that? Is your focus going to be on selling just castings? Oh, hi, D Worm. Is your focus going to be on selling the castings or worms or both? So these are things that you have to consider when you are thinking of starting a commercial worm farm. You also need to consider the cost to set up. Now, depending on the size of the commercial worm farm that you have, it can be very inexpensive to set up or it can be very expensive to set up. That depends on the size, and it depends on whether you're willing to start small and then gradually increase as time goes by. Because one of the dangers of starting large is that if you haven't decided on or do your marketing research on your potential clients, oh, hi, Russell, how much weight or volume of casting harvested weekly? Yes, that's another thing that you need to consider as well. Thanks for that, Russell. So yes, so you have to think about the cost to set up. Starting small is a good idea. And then you also have to consider how familiar are people in your region with worm farming. Are you going to be selling to your locals? Are you going to be selling to 74% in Hindi? Oh, okay. Let's see. Oh, I think I missed a comment from Eric here. Just finished my weekly test, 100% in math, 95 in grammar, and 85 in social study, 74 in Hindi. Way to go, Eric. I'm proud of you. Keep up the good work. 100 in math. That is excellent. But there is still room for improvement on everything else that you got less than 100 on. So don't give up and keep on doing your best. Good job. Yes. So where were we now? Yeah, so we were saying consider the cost. Now, are you choosing the type of setup that you are okay with? You have to consider whether or not it's going to require a lot of lifting, and if you're okay with lifting, you're welcome, Eric. You have to consider whether it's going to involve a lot of bending, whether you want to be sitting as you maintain your bin. Um, Windrows requires a lot of bending because you have to bend to feed the worms, you have to bend to harvest the castings, you have to bend to maintain the worms. So the various type of setup that you use is going to determine how much effort you have to put into the raising worms commercially. Let's see, what amount of worms are going to be produced weekly? Yes, that is also a very good point to consider, because as you know, it is said that worms can produce uh, twice their amount in 3 months, but that is just on the lower side. They can produce less than that in 3 months, and they can produce up to 28 times that in 3 months. So you have to notice the rate at which your worms reproduce, and then that is going to determine also how many bins you're going to have, the size of your bins, and stuff like that. My connection is bad today. Okay, no problem, Eric. I had a similar problem last week. Okay, and speaking of which, I apologize to you guys who were on the live on Monday, because my internet supplier is having a bit of difficulty these days. So from time to time, we will have blackouts, and that happened while we were in the middle of the live. So I apologize for that. Yes. Some bins you can set up so that you are standing to look after them, and you make sure that they are on a level that is comfortable for you to maintain. Now, if you're making your worm bins, oh hi hand white, you don't want to make your bins so wide that it is cumbersome and you have to be bending all the way over to access it. And you don't want to make them so deep that you have to be constantly bending over to access it, because as you bend over, you're putting all of your upper weight onto your spine. So these things you have to take into consideration. What are you going to be feeding your worms? That is something that you have to consider as well. You forgot. That is okay. It's happened to all of us. We're all forgetful from time to time. I know I definitely am. Yes. Um, so, yes, what you're going to be feeding your worms, are you going to be purchasing material for your worms? Are you going to be using just the things that you have around your home? Oh, hi, Pit Stop. Are you able to access materials from places like restaurants, supermarkets, your neighbors, and stuff like that on a frequent basis to keep the supply going? So these are things that you need to consider. You'd also need to consider the consistency of your castings. Oh, hi, Mom. Oh, hi, Helpy. I can't speak for anyone else, but yes, I am doing okay. How about you guys? Are you all doing okay? Yes. So as I was saying, you also have to consider the see, that's what I mean when I said I am forgetful. Yeah, so you have to consider the consistency of the castings. Let's see. Russell says commercial products cannot have seeds, volunteer plants. Yes, that is so true. So you need to ensure then that if you're feeding your worms materials like tomatoes and stuff like that, make sure that you either take the seeds out, which can be a lot of work, or you can just pour hot water on it so that it kills all the seeds, stuff like that. So anything that has seeds that can grow, using hot water is a good way to kill the seeds, although it is best just not to feed stuff that is going to have a lot of seeds in there also. So you can consider, if you're going to have seeds in your castings and you're going to be, and you want to do commercial worm farm, then you can focus on selling worms. See, Melanie says, I thought it was my Wi-Fi. Oh no, it wasn't your Wi-Fi. Um, we were in the middle of our Christian meeting on Zoom on Sunday, and we had a blackout right across the city from the supplier. We had a blackout for several hours, so it wasn't you. And then it happened again on Monday. Of course, Monday it resumed very quickly, thankfully. So it wasn't you, it was our supplier having issues. Okay, you're doing well, LP. That's good. Spring is in the here, so I'm excited. Yes, I think everybody is excited for spring. And I think maybe this year people are looking forward to spring more than previous years. And I think it might have to do with the lockdown and the amount of restrictions that we have. So now any form of freedom that we get to move about outdoors and to be in our garden and stuff like that makes us a little bit more excited than we would normally be. But yes, I feel you. I'm very excited for the spring. Let's see. And White says, I've got seeds in my casting, so thank you for that tip. Okay, you are welcome. I guess you should be thanking Russell. Yeah, so as I was saying, you have to consider lifting your worm bins, bending over to mend your worm bins. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to be elaborating more on each of these types of setup that you can have so that you can make a more informed decision as to what setup you want to use for your worm farm. Now, what are the benefits of each of these setups and the drawbacks of these various setups. No doubt you are right. Okay. Yes. So if you're using the windrow system, that is where you dig trenches in the ground. The length of it doesn't matter. The width of it does matter to an extent because you want to make sure that when you're accessing it, you are able to access it from both sides and be able to access the middle portion of it. So that is important. So I would say between anything up to 2.5 feet should be fine for the width. The length doesn't really matter. Windrow, however, require a lot of bending. You're going to bend to feed the worms. You're going to bend to access your castings. You're going to be bending to do anything at all that you have to do to your worms. Let's see. LP says, I unintentionally planted a boatload of tomato seedlings thanks to my castings. Too bad I didn't want to grow this kind this year, but they will be sacrificed to the animals away from garden. Yes. Well, they can become worm food. And that's what I do if I see any stray plants growing in my castings. They just become worm food. Eric says for lunch, boil and fried dumpling with cassava and stewed chicken. Yes, fried dumpling and cassava. I haven't had cassava in a long while. I haven't seen it at the supermarket. It's very rare that you see it at the supermarket, and it's just one type of supermarkets that you can get it at here. But I love cassava. In fact, I don't know if you know cassava bame, Eric. Um, it is where you make this flat, round cake from the cassava. All it is just cassava and salt, and then you soak it in milk for until it's thoroughly soaked. Take it out and then you fry it. You have to have a reasonable amount of salt on it to make sure that it tastes well. I just took two out of my fridge and put them to soak in the milk so that I can fry them later with fried fish, some escovitch fish. Sounds like you're having a nice lunch. Hey, don't make me hungry now. Let's see. Russell says, I think the most important thing for commercial products, fungus gnats, fruit flies do hatch when castings are used. And mites do not lay eggs on outside. Mites do not lay eggs on the outside, sorry, on the underside of plants. Yes, that is a very big problem. That is one of the reasons why I really don't like food scraps for my worms because it can be a real hassle getting those fruit flies and the fungus gnats to stay put. They just love the food scraps. So I like to use finished compost because it does not attract them. And the setup that I have, it is a bit difficult to keep them out if I feed food scraps. So I rather use castings, but as you see in my video that was uploaded today, that I am changing the way that I do my worm bins because I used to just fill the bins with compost, and that is all that is in the bin, and then I would have had eggshell to it, but I don't really like that method anymore because it is too heavy and the bins are too heavy for me to be lifting when the bins are full. And I always maintain a full bin because the worms have more space to play around. And then the material tend to get compacted, and as it get compacted, it's a bit more challenging for the worms to move around to feed. So now I'm making sure that I had other materials like these and papers to the bin, to each bin. So as I mentioned before about the consistency of your castings, now I am setting up the bin so that each time I feed my bin, it's the same quantity of material. So if I'm using a bucket of shredded paper, that is what's going to be in all my bins. If I'm going to be using a bucket of compost, all the bins get a bucket. And if I'm using dried leaves, all the bins get a bucket. That way, when your clients buy your product, they know that what they're getting is consistent. You don't want to give them something that today it is high in carbon and tomorrow it is high in nitrogen, because then it will be difficult for you to maintain your clients. So it is very important to make sure that your casting is consistent, because the nutrients that the worms are going to get, or the plants are going to get from the castings, it needs to be consistent. So that is something that you need to keep in mind when you are thinking of commercial worm farming. Okay, yes, the underside of the plant leaves. I know that's what you're saying, because that's where those mites like to hide themselves. Oh, you know the pone. Okay. We use the sweet potatoes to make pone. Yes, so with the windrow, continuing with consistency is the key, right? You're right, Russell. Yeah, so with the windrow system, as I was saying before, you can feed your worms using the horizontal migration method. So you feed in one location, and the worms are going to be in the new food that you gave them. They're going to feed on that until it is finished, and then you're going to feed the next location closest to where they were just fed, and they're going to migrate over, and they keep doing that as the worms finish composting the material that is first fed to them and move on. Then you can harvest the castings that they have produced, and that at that time they're working on the new food scraps that you have given them. You can also do surface feeding, where you put the material in there, the worms feed, and when they finish that, you had more food to the top, and the worms move up. The bottom layer is there and ready to harvest. But the horizontal migration feeding is better for windrows, because then you don't have to be moving the worms and the food scraps in order to access the material underneath. So for windrows, horizontal migration is the best method to feed the worms. Bye, Eric. Right. So for windrows, horizontal migration is what works best. Now, if you live in areas where you have freezing temperatures, or you have very hot temperatures, and you're using windrows, then you might want to consider doing it in an enclosure where you can control temperature, and especially depending on the type of worms that you're going to be using. So you have to consider temperature. Definitely for freezing, if you have freezing temperature, then you cannot have them exposed to the atmosphere. Right. And if you're using windrows or whatever setup you are using, you have to make sure that between each worm bin, windrow or whatever it is, you have sufficient space. You're going to need space to get your equipment in to access your castings. You're going to need space to get not just your equipment in, but you need to make sure that when you're moving about in between the rows, when you're accessing the castings or the worms, you have sufficient space to move about freely without bumping into the other worm bin. So that is something that you also need to consider. Right. So if you are not able to create a facility to facilitate the windrow system in freezing temperature, then windrow might not be your best option. Let's see, D-worm, I'm glad I was able to catch your live. Duty calls. Great information. Until next time, bye for now. Okay, D-worm, take care. Have a lovely afternoon. Right, so the next one is continuous flow through system. And as I mentioned before, this is not the domesticated ones that I'm talking about. Okay, thank you, D-worm. Right. So this is not the domesticated type of continuous flow through bin that I'm talking here. Melanie says, when to use grow lights in the night or day. Grow lights, you are mimicking daylight. So you want to use it in the day, and at night you allow your plants to sleep. Now, some of your plants may require 8 hours of light, whether sunlight or grow light. Some of your plants may require 14 hours of light, even 16 hours of light, especially if you're using grow lights. So you have to know your plants, and then those that require more light for longer period, those plants you keep them together, and then the plants that require maybe 8 hours or so, you keep those together. That way you can turn off one set of your lights when it reached the 8 hour, and the other one you can allow to run until it reached the 14 to 16 hours that that plant need. So daylight is the best time to use your grow lights. And this says, nice to see you. Bye for now. Have a wonderful day. Same to you, my dear. Thank you for being here. Right. So for the continuous flow through system, these can be in various sizes, and they do not require a lot of bending, except, of course, when you're collecting the castings from below. Now, continuous flow through system is bins where you surface feed your worms. You can also use horizontal migration with these, but the best method for your continuous flow through is surface feeding. As the worms feed on the material that is on the bottom, they will gradually move up to the top. When it is time to harvest it, you just simply move the food scraps and the worms to one side and take out the material that is on the bottom. Or if you have the system where the bottom is open, you can either use a rake, depending on the type of open bottom system that you have. You can either use a rake to scratch out the castings that is produced on the bottom, or you can use either a manual or a motorized winch attached to a blade that will cut off the castings on the bottom. Usually it cuts between 1 inch to 1.5 inches of castings from the bottom, and this will fall to the ground or into whatever container you have underneath the flow through system. So that is your continuous flow through system. Now, with your continuous flow through system, you're going to have to bend to take the castings from underneath your flow through system, unless, of course, you build your flow through system where you have a container on wheels underneath the bin that you can roll out. Then you don't have to do so much bending. Oh, hi, Newark Gardner. How are you? Right. So these are things that you can consider. Now, a question that a lot of people ask about the continuous flow through system is, will the castings and the worms not fall out of the bin? No, they won't. When you are starting your continuous flow through system, and the bottom of your flow through system can be made from ropes that are placed 1.5 inches to 2 inches apart, or you can use mesh with large holes in it. I would say at least 1 inch of space between each of the mesh. So the holes in the mesh would be at least 1 inch so that the castings can fall through. But when you create or purchase your flow through system, you're going to line the bottom of the bin with newspaper or whatever paper you have and cardboard. Then you're going to add your shredded paper or whatever bedding you're going to be using on top of that. Your worms are, and the food scraps is going to be resting on that. Now that material that you had, whether your bedding, you need to make sure that it is at least 6 inches high. It's going to take a while for the worms to process all of this material. And while they're processing that material and the food scraps, the material is going to become compacted. As it becomes compacted, then there is no room for the material to fall out unless you disturb the material by cutting it or raking it off the bottom. so your worms and stuff will not fall through. Let's see, Russell says, I like the continuous flow through. Cuts a couple of inches of bedding, feed a week, and harvest a couple inches of castings a week. The con is the vertical space lost. Yes, that is so true. And that is why, because if I decide to go on a large scale commercial system, I would use the continuous flow through setup. I could either make it where above that I have shelving that I store my castings so the space is not really being wasted, or I could do a tiered system where I have two sets of worm bins. So one flow through system would be placed 2 feet of open space above or 3 feet above the one that is on the bottom, so that I'll be able to harvest my castings from both of them without one falling into the other. So that is something that I have been working on figuring out how to get that done so that you don't really waste a lot of space. Now, as I go further on into this discussion, I'm going to be discussing the tiered system and how to set it up so that it is not a lot of work, because it can be a lot of work. But yes, the flow through system does cause you to have a lot of wasted space vertically. But there are ways that we can get around that. We can do shelving to store the tools and stuff that we use for the worm farm. We can store castings. There's so much. AJ, hello. I'm stopping by for a few minutes. Okay, no worries. I'm glad that you could stop by even for a few minutes. Yes, so we can always find ways to set up the flow through system where the space above it is not really wasted. Okay, right. So we looked at whether or not the worms and castings will fall out of the flow through system, and we realized that it won't. Oh, thank you, Russell. And the worms will gradually eat the bedding, as I said before, but by then the castings would have been so compacted that it would not be falling out. Now, let's look at stackable trays. Stackable trays require a lot of lifting, and depending on the size, it can be heavy. But the worms usually migrate upwards, leaving the castings in the tray that is below it. And so, because of that, it makes harvesting your castings pretty easy, or should I say easier, right? But then it requires a lot of lifting. So if you're someone who doesn't want to do a lot of lifting, then you might consider another option to stackable trays. And another thing is that the stackable trays are small, so you're going to be needing a lot of them. When you are planning your worm farm, as I mentioned, sitting to look after your worm farm, bending, standing, stooping, or lifting stuff, you have to consider long term. Don't think about just this year and next year. You have to consider long term. So if you say, for example, are someone 65 or 60 and you're thinking of retiring when you're 65, or you'd like to do it past 65, consider what option will work best for you. So whatever you're planning, always think on a long-term basis. Right. New York, never knew there is so much to raising worms. That depends, my dear, on whether you're doing it commercially or you're just doing something for your garden in the backyard. So, because this discussion today is about doing it commercially, so that is why it seems as if there is a lot that you actually need to be doing. But really, if you're just raising worms to use in your garden, there isn't much to be done to it. You just set up your worm bins. Of course, you still want to consider the size of your worm bins if you are concerned about lifting and stuff like that. You still have to consider that. And you still have to consider space. But most times, for people who do worm farming for their garden, they may have maybe up to five or so worm bins. So it's not much to maintain. You feed the worms, you water the worms. When the casting is ready, you harvest the worms and the castings. You restart your bin and you monitor your bin to make sure that they have the right temperature, the moisture, and stuff like that. But if you're doing worm farming for domestic purposes, there isn't really much that is required. And you can do it commercially and not have a lot that is required depending on the size of your commercial setup and depending on your clientele. What is it going to be? Are you selling to fishermen? Are you selling to just your neighbors? Are you selling to backyard gardeners? Stuff like that. So how much work goes into it depends on what your final intent is. Okay, AJ says you are right. Okay, thank you, AJ. Now, what about using buckets for your commercial setup? A 5 gallon bucket is good to use. Of course, this is going to require a lot of buckets because they are small, and then you can stack them together vertically, but then it also involves a lot of lifting. So that you have to take into consideration. When you stack them together, you're maximizing space, so that is good. But then, because the surface area of your bucket is just a little bit over a square foot, it means that you cannot really have a lot of worms in the bucket at any given time. You might be able to have 2 pounds of worms in your bucket. Some might push it to the limit and have three, but you might have the situation where your worms start to crawl out of the bin because they don't have enough space. So you have to consider that. Yes. So, and then you can only top feed when when you're using buckets to feed your worms, to raise your worms. So you can only surface feed them. And then you have to take out the food scraps and the worms as they migrate up to the top in order to harvest your castings. You can't do horizontal migration feeding. You can't do anything like that. So at all times with the buckets, you're going to have to be disturbing your worms in order to access it. Melanie said, thank you. Can I use a regular lamp? You can use a regular lamp, but the bulb that you use need to produce enough energy or light to mimic what the sun would provide. So regular lights will not provide that amount of light or energy for your plants. So even if you're using a regular lamp, the bulb that you use must produce enough. So Russell says 5 gallon buckets are free. If you spend money, it would be three. Yes, buckets you can sometimes you can get them for free. In my region, not always. And I don't like Home Depot buckets for worm farming or for gardening. I don't like the material that Home Depot uses for their buckets because when it gets hot, and then it gets cold, it gets very crispy and it breaks very easily. So if you're planning something long term, then no offense to Home Depot, but because I love shopping at Home Depot, but their buckets I would not necessarily recommend because they break very easily because of the plastic that it is made from. But yes, the buckets are fairly cheap, but then considering how many of them you might need depending on the size of your buckets, it might not be cheap. And in my region, the buckets are $3 before taxes, and then you have to pay about $2 for the cover, so you're paying $5 something before taxes for a bucket. So yeah, it's cheaper to buy a tote. You buy a tote, which holds maybe three of those or two of those 5 gallon buckets, and it's $7, and you're getting twice as much storage capacity and stronger material. So yeah. AJ, do you have time to share how you got started with worms? How long have you been a worm farmer? People thought that I was crazy when I first got started.